going to be talking about Ira, who is right here, Ira Marcus. I know you guys can't see him yet, but he's right here. And he has been a photographer since he was 11 years old. So he's had a lot of experience. And he's in his working life was a facility manager for different companies. But in his retirement life has been very active and doing many different things for many different organizations as a volunteer. And one of those is this art and artifacts exhibit that we've had up for the last year. And we're so happy to have had him do that. Plus he volunteers here and does all our photography for the collection, which you see online on our webpage, the website for the museum. So please welcome Ira Marcus.
Thank you. Thanks, Liz, for that very nice introduction. As Liz said, today we're going to be talking about capturing history through the photographer's lens. We're going to talk about how photography impacts the way we see history. And I thought it would be good to start out with a quote that's kind of relevant. Helmut Gershine was a photographic historian and writer. And in 1962, in an article, he said this: "Photography is the only language understood in all parts of the world and bridging all nations and cultures. It links the family of man. Independent of political influence, where people are free, it reflects truthfully life and events, allows us to share in the hopes and despair of others, and illuminates political and social conditions. We become the eyewitnesses of humanity and inhumanity of mankind." So I kind of thought that kind of puts our mindset of a little bit about what photography does for us. But I want you to think about this portion in here where it says it reflects truthfully life and events. We're going to come back to that statement throughout this presentation. So today's agenda, we will start out with looking at how we saw images of history before there was photography. We'll do a brief history of photography and how it grew from camera obscura in the 1600s to today's cell phones. We're going to talk about 5 different pioneers who are really storytellers and historians who use photography to advance how we look at history. A section I'm calling No Caption Required. We're going to look at a bunch of photos from the last 100 years or so, and we'll talk a little bit about how these photos have an impact on how we understand history. And then we're going to bring things back locally here to Elgin. Elgin has a very rich photographic history, and we're going to talk about Elgin, Illinois' early photographers. And then we'll move on to talk about what the museum has in terms of photography, quite a collection. So we'll be talking about that. And then what Liz mentioned early on, that's Past Perfect photo project, where we're putting the museum's objects online. I'll just give you a very brief story of what's behind the Art and Artifacts exhibit that's here in the museum. And then finally, for those of you who want to stick around afterwards, we'll do a little tutorial on photographing your own historic objects with some hands-on things that you can practice photographing. And Trish, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're going to try to keep that available for Zoom people? I am. So if you're around with my camera. Yeah, so Trish here, who works at the museum, will follow us around when we do our hands-on. So for those of you who are on Zoom, if you want to stick around, you'll be able to do that. So let's move on and get right into things here. Photography has only been around for about 180 years. Prior to photography, images and their intended messages reflect the desires of artists and or their patrons, not necessarily accurate descriptions of events. So let's take a look at what we saw. In this first image, we have a cave painting from early France, showed a bit of a buffalo hunt there. We move on to ancient Egypt, and you have hieroglyphics and you have drawings inside of tombs and pyramids. Moving forward a little bit further, here we have a painted image of King John signing the Magna Carta. Now, let me just back up to that for a minute. In these 3 depictions, these are all things that people couldn't see unless they went somewhere, especially the drawings inside of tombs. They weren't really meant for the general public. But now come the 1440s and we have the printing press. So we have things that we can engrave images and we can distribute those by printing them for the masses. Here's a more recent image from our own history. This is Washington crossing the Delaware, and that's exactly how it looked, wasn't it? Well, according to historians, not really. Okay, so let's take a look at the history. So photography, as I said, it's only been around about 180 years, but images were captured prior to that. You just couldn't keep them. So the camera obscura, and in Latin, that means dark chamber. The camera obscura came about in 1646. Basically, it was a dark box with a small hole in the front, maybe a lens on it. And on the back, the light would pass through that hole, and on the back surface would be projected the image. This was not used to permanently create prints because there was no way of fixing that image. So this would be largely used by artists who wanted to capture a scene of something, and they could then trace how this image was projected. As you can see on here, there's mirrors and things. So have any of you looked at a solar eclipse with one of those boxes that you put a hole in? I see a few nods. Well, that is basically a camera obscura. So kind of a modern version of a camera obscura. So we move on. In the period 1835 to 1837, which is when the first prints were actually made. Now, prior to that time, in 1802, Thomas Wedgwood discovered the light's effect on silver nitrate. And Thomas Wedgwood was of the Wedgwood family that we all know from cameos and the work that they did. But it wasn't until 1826 when Joseph, and this is a tongue twister for me, Joseph Nicephore-Niepce created the first photo. And what he did was, it was called a heliograph. And the first photo that was known to man to actually be fixed where we could look at it at some time in the future was out of a window in France. I'm going to show you that photo in just a moment. In 1835, I'm jumping a century ahead of myself, and 1837, we had William Henry Thomas, or I'm sorry, we had Talbot, I was going to say Fox, but William Fox Talbot was playing around, and he had figured out how to fix images on paper. He also did negative things, and he was in England. At the same time, in France, there was Louis Daguerre, and he had partnered with Niepce. Unfortunately, Niepce had passed away in 1833, and Daguerre kind of finished that work that they had partnered on together. And Daguerre had actually discovered a way to create a positive image that would be fixed. And that image, that process was patented, and the government in France at the time bought that patent and made it available to the public. So this is where printed photography, as we know it today, really got started. Here are a couple images. The first one up in the upper left is a view from the window in Le Grasse, France. It's a heliograph by Joseph Nicephore-Niepce in 1826. He did that image. And then the image in the bottom right is the latticed window from Laycock Abbey, and this was taken by William Henry Fox Talbot in 1835. This is really the first known negative image where we go from negative to making a positive print. So Daguerre and Talbot had some different processes, but they both came out about the same time, and it's what really opened up photography for the rest of us. In 1854, André Adolphe Desdery patented something he called the carte de visite. And probably we're familiar with that. That's a 2.5-inch by 4-inch print of usually a portrait of somebody. And they, if you were anybody who was anybody, you went to a studio and had a carte de visite made, and they were handed out as calling cards. It became very popular, and studios really proliferated during this time period from 1854 on beyond to the 1900s. Also during this time, the stereoscope was invented and used. It was really invented in 1832, but it became a little more common in 1849 when it was further enhanced. So the stereoscope takes two very similar images and you use a device to look through it and it will make your images look 3D. Sorry about that. So anyhow, this became very popular as kind of parlor entertainment. Queen Victoria was somebody who was a big fan of stereoscopes. And because of that, many other people followed suit, and stereoscopes were a big form of entertainment. We also had something kind of unique to this period, and this was death photos. So people were taking pictures of corpses, usually children, because there was high infant and child mortality during this time. And we may think of it as really being kind of creepy today, but back then it was looked at as a way of preserving the memory of that individual. So here, just a couple of these different images. Here's what a carte de visite looks like. And if you remember this time frame, this is right, during and before the Civil War too. So many Civil War soldiers and prominent people wanted to have a carte de visite made. A stereoscope. Now we have a stereoscope in the museum, and I think there's one on display in that photo display in the first floor. So afterwards, if you want to go down, you can take a look at what a stereoscope looks like. And here is a child in repose. And the family was probably very happy to have that photo because they could remember that person forever. These death photos were also taken to prove that certain people were dead. People like Jesse James, and people who were notorious. So that was pretty popular during that time. We move forward into 1888. 1888 was a pivotal point because in 1888, George Eastman creates the first camera for use by amateurs. And this is a camera, it's kind of interesting. You bought it with the film in it. And by this time we advanced to having negative films. You bought it with the film in it. When you exposed all the film, there were about 100 sheets. You sent it into a lab. They developed your print and they refilled your camera with new film. I kind of call this period for this presentation my Kodak Moments period, because there was so much advancement and change in photography during that time. There were more genres of photography became the norm. Prior to this time, you mostly were just doing pictures of people, portraits. Now you had people doing landscapes, and as time went on and cameras advanced, you had family pictures and everything you could think of. So roll film came out in about 1900. Sometime a little bit later, you had 35 millimeter film and smaller cameras that were more portable. Every few years, there's new developments in cameras or in different technology. We had the introduction of flash photography. We had the introduction of color photography. In 1948, Edwin Land came out with the Polaroid, so you didn't have to send your stuff to a lab anymore. You could develop it yourself. The other thing that changed a lot during this period was we had a lot of people getting interest in photography as an art. And we had a lot of different movements and societies. So there was a pictorialism movement in the 1890s with emphasis on composition and emotional impact, which was something different. Instead of just a stiff person in a studio, now you were doing landscapes and flowers, all kinds of things. Photo secession movement came about in 1902. And that was a time to move away from some of the Victorian realism to be more painterly and artistic. You had Dadaism, which was kind of an irrational form of art. We had something called New Vision that came later, and then also something called social commentary photography. So those things all happened in that period. And I wanted to share with you just a couple of people who were very prominent in some of these, but we're not going to talk a lot about them because really their work was not about history. It was about changes in photography. So a few of the names you might recognize, Alfred Stieglitz, who lived from 1864 to 1946. And his big thing was exploration of the familiar. He was really the founder of the photo cessation movement. And the reason it was called that is there was a Royal Photo Society in England, and these are people who seceded from that society looking at photograph differently. My remote's falling apart here. So in this first photo, kind of tiny to see, these are hands on the skull. Those are the hands of Georgia O'Keeffe on that skull. We have Edward Steichen from 1879 to 1973. He put together an exhibit with many photographers at the Museum of Modern Art in New York called The Family of Man, and he curated this exhibit. This image here is of Gloria Swanson as a very young person, but a very dramatic artistic image, not your typical portrait. Edward Weston came along from 1886 to 1958. His big thing was realism and very sharp detail. This is one of a series of very famous images of a pepper. Man Ray, from 1890 to 1976, flouted convention. He did a lot of things different, a lot of Dada photos and surreal, abstract. He invented something called the Rheograph, where you just put objects on a piece of film. You're not even using a camera per se, and expose the film to light with those objects. So here you can see a comb and some other just ordinary objects on there. I know these images are very small, but I just wanted to give you a kind of a feel for this. Probably a few of you have heard of Ansel Adams. Ansel Adams founded the F-64 group, which was a kind of a society. He's really known for his landscapes and what he calls a zone system for black and white photography, where from absolute black to absolute white, he divides those shades into 7 different zones, and how you use those in your photo was a big part of that. The F-64 connotation comes from the f-stop, or the aperture size, and I see a few camera people here, so you probably understand that F-64, when you have your camera set at that, is going to give you a very sharp, very crisp image. And then I'm going to wrap this up here with Henry Cartier-Bresson. Did I do that well? Thank you, Jackie. She helped me with pronouncing that correctly. From 1908 to 2004. And he was very big. This is when you talk about social commentary photography a little bit, on seizing the character of the people in the image, capturing expressions, and very importantly, capturing a decisive moment of the image. So in this picture right here, we can see that there's a couple kissing, looks like at a bistro or something, but you notice a dog looking up at him. There are a lot of very famous photos you've seen by him. You may have not known that he did them, but you would probably recognize the photo. Okay, now we're coming into an era that everybody here should remember, and that's the era of digital photography. So the digital camera was invented by a Kodak engineer named Stephen Sasson, and he did that in 1973, so it's quite a while ago. Patented in 1978, but Kodak wasn't real interested in developing this further, because obviously Kodak manufactured film, and digital cameras, as we know today, have pretty much eliminated the use of film. This camera he's holding in this photo was made from spare parts that he found around the Kodak labs, and he developed it. The downside of this particular camera he invented, it took 23 seconds to make an image on it. So I don't think that they thought it was real practical. But by 1990, there were a few manufacturers that started coming up with their own digital cameras. And 94, 95 is really when digital photography started to take off. And it's just gone way past that. Finally, we bring us up to today. And we have, everybody here probably has a cell phone camera, I'm guessing. And we have social media, and that's really democratized photography. Everybody's a photographer now. Everybody's an on-the-spot reporter, and we have images that can capture every part of human endeavor. But it took a while to get to all this. So let's go back again, and we're going to take a look at some of the very early photo pioneers who changed the way we see history. One of the first that I want to talk about, and the best known probably, is Matthew Brady. He lived from 1822 to 1896. And two things he's best known for are the Gallery of Illustrious Americans and Civil War photographs. So he opened up his studio and gallery in 1844 on Broadway in New York City. And he wanted to create an historical photo record of all important people. And he was quite the marketer. And maybe part of the reason he was quite the marketer is just a couple buildings down the street from him was P.T. Barnum's museum. And he partnered a lot with P.T. Barnum on things, including photographing the wedding of Tom Thumb. Some of you may know about that. Tom Thumb was a little person and was kind of an attraction at the museum. But Matthew Brady did an awful lot of things to be, quote, the nation's photographer, as it were. And he had the studio, he had a number of people working for him. Then when the war broke out, and one thing I should mention about the studio, very often people would come in and he would do the photograph, but he had painters and lithographers that he worked with that would then paint the photographs so it looked more like a painting. Prior to this time, if you were wealthy or a person of import, you would have your portrait painted. Now you could have it photographed and then painted over. But when you look at the historical aspect of what he did, the Civil War breaks out and he wants to create a record of the Civil War. So one of the things he did is the first battle of Bull Run, he went and he photographed that battle as best he could. Now, he was not really able to photograph the battle well because there's too much movement. And at that point in time, to take an image, you didn't just click at 1/60th or 1/250th of a second the way you do today. You had to hold that camera open, maybe 5 or 6 seconds or more to create your image. And in a battle, things are frenzied and there's a lot going on. He also, I think in things I've read, was a little frightened because that battle turned out to be a rout. And in the retreat, all of the glass negatives that he took were destroyed. So there is no record, photographic record of that battle. But going forward throughout the Civil War, he had a number of photographers, somebody named Alexander Gardner, which we'll talk about in just a second, Timothy O'Sullivan, a man named Bernard, a man named Gibson. A lot of these people, all their photographs were attributed to Brady's studio. So many of the photographs that they took during that whole period of the Civil War are attributed to Brady. So everybody thinks Matthew Brady was this great Civil War photographer. He only did a fraction of the images that are attributed to him. So let's take a look at some of these. So here's a photo that he took of Lincoln in 1860 in February. And according to Matthew Brady in a later interview, he said, Lincoln told him that Brady and the Cooper Institute made me president. Cooper Institute is a place where Abraham Lincoln was giving a campaign speech that day, and it turned out to be a fairly famous speech. Again, we talk about Matthew Brady being quite the marketer. Did Abraham Lincoln really say that? Maybe, maybe not. I wanted to include this image. This was taken at Antietam. This was taken by Alexander Gardner. And here we have Alan Pinkerton on the right-hand side. And we probably know a little bit about Alan Pinkerton as he was from this area and actually has a connection to this museum, to this building. And General McClernand, who was, I believe, a former partner of Lincoln's. For a while, I thought that might have been McClellan because Pinkerton was assigned to work with McClellan with his group of spies spying for the Union. Interesting thing is this picture is often attributed to Brady, but again, it was Alexander Gardner. And then this last picture attributed to Brady shows a battle of Antietam. Now, the interesting thing is this, to me, looks like this is in battle, but Alexander Gardner didn't arrive in Antietam until 2 days after the battle was done. So is it staged? Maybe, maybe not. Was there a small skirmish afterwards? But one of the things that I find interesting in this, and when we talk about how we see history through these photographs, if you look in the back, it looks like there's a lot of bystanders. Well, there were. There was an artist who was covering the battle, and he had written in his memoirs of the battle, he said, the hillsides were black with spectators. And people did come out in some of these earlier battles during the war. They came out to watch the battle. So it's something a little different than what we have today. There are about 10,000 images that are still available today from the Civil War. Many, if not most, from Brady's studio. Alexander Gardner split off from Brady. They had a parting of the ways, and some of the other photographers went with him. But well, let's keep moving here. The next person that we would like to talk about is Edward S. Curtis. Curtis was born in 1868 to homesteaders outside Seattle, Washington. And he's best known for his books, The North American Indian, which is a 20-volume set, which he spent the years 1900 to 1930. And what he did is he had a studio business in Seattle where he's, again, taking a lot of famous people's portraits and all of the who's who of the Seattle area. He took a photograph of Princess Angeline, who was Chief Seattle's youngest child, who was quite old at that point, and realized that all of the richness of the Native American culture was dying out, and somewhat purposely by our government was forcing them to give up their culture, sending their children to Indian schools, not letting them continue their way of life. And Curtis was quite the outdoorsman, and he felt he wanted to capture as much as he could. So had befriended Teddy Roosevelt, and Roosevelt got behind this. They got J.P. Morgan to finance this. So for 30 years, Curtis went around photographing and creating these images. It's quite a wonderful collection. But at the time, there were a lot of issues with it. There wasn't as big of an interest in buying these books. He was very particular about how he made the photographs and how the books were printed. So they didn't do real well, and he ended up in poverty and estranged from his family. But very recently, I believe it was 2009, I had this on here, a complete set sold for $1.9 million. So there's a piece of history that's captured there, and there are a number of complete sets that are in various institutions around the country. A couple other quick things. He also did 10,000 audio recordings with wax, the Edison wax recording cylinders that he preserved some of the Indian language. And he actually was the first to do a film documentary, which he did in 1916. A couple of his images just of the way of Indian life. Some of his images were posed. They weren't all candid, which reminds me, I wanted to go back just a little bit when I talked about Brady and Alexander Gardner. Remember, I asked you to remember that little part of that quote that says reflects the truth in photographs. Well, Alexander Gardner actually had moved some dead bodies after one of the battles to a better place to photograph them. One of the things, because you're eating lunch today, I kind of made sure we didn't have some of the photos in this presentation that are pretty disturbing, but he did a lot of dead body photos, and he actually moved some. Matthew Brady had taken a photograph of one of his assistants playing dead. And we know that because there's a photograph before and after that where the same assistant is standing and helping him do things in these photographs. And the next one, he's posed as a dead soldier. So photographs reflect what the camera and you see, but reflecting truth may be another issue here. So let's take a look at a couple more of Curtis's photographs. Again, just some of Indian life. And here we have a composite. The lower right picture in here is Princess Angeline, who is Seattle's granddaughter. And that was the last image that was ever made of her. Obviously, you can tell she's a little older there. Okay, we'll move forward to our next pioneer. That's Dorothea Lang. And Dorothea Lang, from 1895 to 1965, was best known for her Depression era photos. She worked for the Farm Security Administration as well as Life magazine. And during the time she worked for the Farm Security Administration, she was documenting the Japanese-American internment during World War II. Here are a couple of her photos. This one, how many of you have seen this photo before? I think almost everybody raised their hand. Did you know this was a posed photo? It's not a candid. Some people are nodding. Again, just because it's in photography doesn't mean it's the truth, but even though it's a posed photo, it is representative of what she was seeing in these migrant work camps. And here we have a photo from a Japanese internment camp of people working, presumably what looks like art projects or maybe calligraphy of some type. There were quite a number of photos that I found here of Dorothea Lang's that were from the Japanese internment. Really interesting stuff. Closed buildings that were businesses owned by Japanese being hauled onto buses. It really tells a poignant story of that episode in our history. Moving on, Margaret Bourke-White. She lived from 1904 to 1971. She was also a life photographer, and she was one of the first women to be embedded with combat units. And she was with General Patton's division when they rescued or freed the Buchenwald concentration camp. She's best known really for her photos from the camp. Here's one. The only one that I could find that I felt I could really show that wasn't too disturbing. And it's not that I didn't want to show disturbing photos, because they're a part of our history. It's important. I just wanted to keep this in a way, especially again, for people who are eating, but some of her photos are really, really disturbing to look at, but that's the events that we lived through, or at least some of our ancestors did. Oops, go to there. Okay, our next photo that she did, we talked about social commentary as a movement of photography. Here I think we have some social commentary. Does anybody kind of pick up why I included this slide? Any thoughts on that? Yeah, March.
It's a bread line, most likely during the Depression, and yet we have the highest standard of living.
Yeah, yeah, and if you look, here there's a highest standard of living if you're a white middle class family, but if you are a person of color or a minority or part of the excluded part of our society, you were in a bread line. So again, social commentary photography there. And our last photographer that I want to talk about as a pioneer is Gordon Parks. Gordon Parks lived from 1912 to 2006. He was best known for photographing the African-American experience in the 1940s. In 1937, he was a waiter on a train, and he picked up a Life magazine that had photos from Dorothea Lang in it. And he was inspired by those photos and decided he wanted to become a photographer. And he also then went to work for the Farm Security Administration and did a lot of photographs in the historical section, of the Black experience in Washington, D.C. at that time. He spent 6 decades as a poet, writer, a photographer, and activist. A couple of his images. This image is titled Coal Skecher, and this is a coal sketcher was somebody who worked on the back of a coal delivery truck. And I think, again, a very poignant image. It's a kind of job that, yes, it was a job, but this individual might not have had the opportunity for a better job. It was just a bit of a commentary there. And then this image, the caption on this image says, "Trapped in an abandoned building by a rival gang on the street. Red Jackson ponders his next move." And that's from 1948. And this and many of the other images are on a permanent exhibit in the National Gallery of Art. Okay, we've talked about 5 historical pioneers in photography, and we talked about 6 of the people who used art or moved photography forward in art. And there are many more we could have talked about, but I think these were some of the more significant names that we had out there. So let's move on. There's some components of a great photo that I'd like to share with you. One is it captures a decisive moment. We saw that from Cartier-Bresson's photos. It tells a story. I think we've seen that in some of the examples that I showed you from Brady and some of the others here. It evokes an emotional reaction, and it will stand the test of time. So again, when we look at photography and its impact on history, we think about some of those components. Now, thanks to mass distribution of photos through magazines such as Look, Life, National Geographic, and through agencies like Associated Press and UPI, as well as national and international TV networks, people around the world are all seeing the same images. So I've got a series of 35 pictures that we're just going to go right through pretty quickly. These are very iconic pictures. Many are part of our collective memory. You know, I asked you how many had seen that picture of the migrant farm worker. You're going to recognize many of these pictures that I'm going to show you in a minute. They serve as a testament to how powerful photography has become, because when you look at these pictures, you're going to pretty much know instantly what the event was they were around. So as I said, we're going to move quickly through them. As you view the photo, I'd like you to just shout out what you think the photo is. And we're going to come back then and discuss a few of them. For those of you on Zoom, we tested this out the other day. There's about a 2-second delay, so it might be a little tougher for you folks to participate, but you can yell at home to yourself. So here we go. Here's the first one. Wright brothers in 1903.
Kitty Hawk. Oh, San Francisco earthquake.
Yep. Okay. I recognize that voice.
Hi, Ira.
Hi, Ralph.
Women's suffrage.
Yep. And this photo, I don't have an exact date on it, but it would have been somewhere between 1848 and 1917. Trench warfare, World War I. St. Valentine's Day Massacre, 1929.
Jesse Owens.
Now, you know, the interesting thing here, when you talk about a little bit of social commentary in pictures and how we view history, here's Jesse Owens saluting the American flag, and obviously a German athlete behind him with the Nazi salute. Interesting juxtaposition there.
The Hindenburg.
Okay, now this one. Anybody know anything about this photo?
It was
posed. Yeah, that's very, very good. Thank you for sharing that. Pardon me? Yeah, yeah. So, but it depicts kind of what happened, but it was a posed shot. The other interesting thing when you talk about how a photo stays in our memory and how it impacts things, there's a country song written about one of the people in that photo. I don't know if anybody you've ever heard the song called Drunken Ira Hayes. Ira Hayes, and the song tells his story of his life, basically. But he was one of the Marines in that photo. The Yalta Conference. Here's another interesting one. When I was searching for a photo of this, There were a number of these photos that were all pretty much the same. It's just different expressions. They were taken moments apart from one another. So you might not have one iconic photo, but a number of iconic photos of something that come to your mind.
VE Day.
Yep, VE Day.
Joseph McCarthy.
McCarthy Senate hearings. Now, this is interesting because again, the shot, I was talking about this with my wife, Jackie, and she had mentioned this is not the picture that comes to her mind when she thinks of this. And I think we had the same picture in mind. I couldn't find it. So, it may not be out in the public domain, but we've probably all seen the picture of him actually in Congress. So. Yeah. Okay, this was on February 9th in 1956. 8 years later to the day. Does anybody know what happened? There you go.
What did he say?
It was the Beatles was on Ed Sullivan.
Oh,
I thought it was interesting that it was actually to the same day 8 years later.
I have a dream speech.
LBJ being sworn in and arriving in America. Yep, Sonny Liston fight.
And Goodall.
This was in 1965, and when the National Geographic first published the chimpanzee studies she did.
Did they get married?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And again, a little difference. The picture, very similar to the picture of Jesse Owens that we saw with Jesse Owens with his heart on his hand. And here we have the Black Power salute a few years later by the athletes. Yeah, and a little bit of social commentary in some of these photos.
Woodstock. Neil Armstrong. Kent State.
Now, sometimes the photo itself becomes a story, as we talked about that Ujima photo. The young lady here, her name was Marianne Vecchio, who was crying out for help. The student, Jeffrey Miller, who was shot and killed, is in there, and the photographer, John Philo. Well, there was an article just earlier this year in the Washington Post in April of this year about Marianne Vecchio. She was a 14-year-old girl at the time, just sort of passing through and hanging out different places. She was a runaway. And because of this photo, she claims, and let me read the quote. And 50 years later, I still really haven't moved on. She had so much publicity from this photo and it so impacted her life. Not only the event of her being there at the time when this young man was killed, but she was hounded afterwards. She was followed by the FBI, a lot of issues. So sometimes photography is just not the bystander, but actually becomes part of the story itself. Yep. Now, how many of you have seen this photo within the last month? Yeah.
I saw it in my mind recently as I was watching television with the desperate evacuation.
Yeah. So if you didn't hear on Zoom, she said, I saw this in my mind when they were dealing with the evacuations in Afghanistan. Sadat and Begin at the Peace Accords.
Challenger. Tiananmen Square.
Yep, that's Mandela being released from prison in 1990. Okay, just from the groans and the whatever, I don't even think we need to say what this is, but that was a Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton scandal.
9/11. Oh, Saddam Hussein.
Fall of, yep, in 2003. Now, I don't know if this is really going to be an iconic photograph, but if you're a Cub fan, it definitely is. And it may be the only time we'll ever see that, so. So the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. So, you know, these last few photos are really too recent to be iconic photos at this point, but I bet we'll be looking at these for a long time to come. And this last one, just a shot of the pandemic things. So I want to ask you, well, first of all, we've just viewed 118 years of history in photos. And since I put this together over the last month or so and collecting these photos, I can't tell you how many of these I have seen either in news articles or on television, referring to things today or looking back at them. So they really do represent this whole period of time. So I want to ask you some questions about the photos. Did they capture a decisive moment? Yeah, most of them did. Did they tell a story? Maybe not a truthful story always, but they told a story. Did they evoke an emotional reaction? Yep, I heard some groans on some of them and some, oh yes, on others. Did they stand the test of time? I think so, most of them did. Okay. So when you think of an event such as the Challenger explosion or the end of World War II or the Kent State shooting or 9/11, do you automatically recall either one of these photos or a similar photo that's iconic? And just some things to ponder then. Do photos like these shape the way we see historical events? Yeah, to some extent they do. And if they do you think we have more of an understanding or less of an understanding of the history than if we only had written accounts of the event? I mean, we could discuss this all day, but I'm just curious to see what you think, more of an understanding?
More.
And I would say in some ways we have less of an understanding because sometimes we think of the entire event as just this one photo. And we don't necessarily know what happened a moment before, what happened a moment later. We don't have the complete context. So I think photos are great. And you know, you're talking to a photographer here, but I think photos are great for bringing us history, but they also, if we're lazy, and I don't mean to accuse anybody of being lazy, but if we don't learn our history beyond what we see in the photo, we maybe aren't getting a complete or true picture. And I think if there's one thing to take away from this today, it would be that we can't depend totally on what we see. We need to use our brain a little bit and dig a little deeper.
They also evoke emotion.
Yeah.
That, you know, if you were there, experiencing it.
Right, yeah. For those who maybe couldn't hear on Zoom, she just said, it also, you know, if they evoke emotion, that maybe you wouldn't experience unless you were there. And my last point on this, are these photos such as we just viewed unbiased, or do they project a specific point of view? And it's funny, you just said, but I have here, think about how they evoked an emotional reaction. Okay, we're going to bring things a little closer to home here, and we're kind of getting close to wrapping up. I want to talk about Elgin's early photographers. And before I do, I want to thank Rebecca Miller, who's not in the room, and Beth Nawara and David Siegenthaler. David Siegenthaler, just got lazy, left off your last syllable, whose research and help with this section made me able to put it together. So in 1851, there was an ad for Rudolphus Paddleford in the Elgin Gazette, which I'm going to read to you in a minute, but Rudolphus Paddleford came to Elgin in 1842 and was Elgin's first known photographer. In 1847, he had a Daguerrean panoramic of Elgin's east side, and that's the earliest known surviving photo. This was an ad in the Elgin Gazette in 1851, which I'm just going to read to you, and I have to stand in front because it's really hard to read, so forgive me. But it says, the undersigned, from his experience in the profession and his facilities for obtaining the latest improvements in the art, feels justified in assuring the public that the picture taken by him shall combine every perfection attainable to the present highly improved condition of this beautiful art. That's the first sentence. Pictures taken without regard to weather. No person will be required or expected to take a likeness which is not in all respects perfect and satisfactory. Painting, daguerreotype, and other pictures accurately copied. Particular attention paid to the instruction of pupils. R.W. Paddleford, July 13th, 1850, although that appeared in 1851 in the Gazette. And we have that paper here in the museum. So that's pretty interesting to see where that comes from. He also mentions in his headline there, Skylight Daguerreotype Gallery over Theft's Drugstore. Because of the amount of light needed in these early photographs, many studios put a skylight in the top to let natural light come in. So here's that earliest known photograph that we talked about. It was a daguerreotype made by Paddleford in 1847. It was later copied and made into a glass negative by John Manly Adams, who I'll talk about in a second. And Elmer Gillick, who was a collector and donated a lot of images to the museum here, made a copy of that. It was recently digitized over the last however many years, and it enables us to project it up here. So even though the technology changes over the years, as we saw in one of those very early slides, photography has allowed us to keep images from the past. Paddleford had a sister, Abigail, and her husband, Edward Adams, had a son called John Manly Adams, who lived from 1833 to 1901. And John Manly Adams also became a photographer. He pursued a number of other careers, studied photography in 1860, and by 1870 opened his own studio. He and his wife Carolyn had a son, Spencer Adams, who lived from 1852 to 1922, who took over the Adams studio. And he and his wife Elizabeth had a daughter, Mabel, in 1876, who lived from 1876 to 1970, who was the third generation of Adams photographers. So they had quite a legacy here in Elgin. And here is his ad, this one in the District Democrat a few years later in 1864. And his ad reads, Daguerrean Fine Art Gallery, pictures of the latest and most improved style, taken on reasonable terms and with dispatch by the subscriber. He flatters himself that no gallery in the city can give greater satisfaction. So, you know, his emphasis now is a little more on cost and value, just 14, 15 years later than Paddleford's ad. So here's a picture of his second studio. This is on Chicago Street, right at the river. That's Adams standing next to what's called a sun enlarger or sun camera, which is how they reproduce prints, because they didn't have the lighting technology that we have today. So they used the sun as a part of reproducing prints. And here's the interior of Spencer Adams' photo studio, 1 East Chicago. The image isn't dated on this, but this is very typical of a lot of the images I saw of the early photographers. Matthew Brady's studio on Broadway in New York was a big gallery of photos that he liked to bring people into to view the photos. It's how he developed his business. So there are always a lot of photos scattered around on these. In the 1885 directory, which we have upstairs here in the museum, a city directory of Elgin, they listed 5 photographers, as you can see there. And as we move forward, 1840s through 1870s, there are about 9 photographers in Elgin. Through 1906, the average went down a little bit to 5 and went back up a few years later to 7. Today, there's only 1 physical studio in Elgin that I could identify, but we have tons of photographers and professional photographers, some of whom run studios out of their home, Some, it's more on-site work that they do and at their clients' locations. So, and a few of those people are probably in this room. I know at least one. But at any rate, we have quite a bit of professional photography here in Elgin now. This image is kind of an interesting panoramic I wanted to share. This was taken by a gentleman named George E. Bowen. George Bowen was not a photographer, but he did it under the direction of Stephen Platt. This was in 1884, looking east up National Street. And he did this from a light tower. There were a number of light towers in Elgin that were about 100 feet tall, or maybe a little taller than that provided light for the city. Stephen Platt was not about to climb to the top of that tower, but Bowen was somebody who worked on the towers. So he gave Bowen his camera, which was not like the 35 millimeters we see with some people or your cell phone. It was, you know, a huge camera that he climbed up to the top with and directed him on how to take this photograph. And here's, you can see that what that light tower looks like a little bit in the background. So it was quite a climb to make. And this was not the same light tower, but it was a similar one. So these last few images came out of the museum's collection. And I want to share a little bit about what the museum has here to offer. So we have over 16,000 printed images. The most notable is probably the Gillick collection. Elmer Gillick was a photographer, he was an architect, a collector, and he collected all these images over his lifetime, mounted many of them on a backing board. Often on the back, he had articles about the image or written information. Upon his death, they were all donated to the museum. So there's about 5,000 of those images. Another collection, the Gussler collection, has got 1,300 images. And then we have the Courier News Photo Archives from 1936 to 1986 with an online index. And David, who's been working on that, are they all indexed at this point, David, or mostly indexed? Yeah, but not all online yet. Yeah, but not online, but we have the information indexed about these. And we also have gotten a recent grant to, there are about, by the way, 100,000 negatives in this collection. And,
Hello?
We've got a recent
Hello?
grant. We got somebody helloing us here. We're currently working on restoring 200 of the negatives that are really badly damaged. And it's a little bit of a challenge, but a number of those will be preserved. In addition to the photos, there are a few books in our library that document early Elgin. So there's a Pictorial Elgin dated in 1902, a picture book of Elgin photos. In 1886, there's a book published, Elgin Pictorial and Descriptive. In 1891, a book called Elgin and Surroundings. And then in 1914, there's a book called The Elgin Known the World Over. And these are all photos of Spencer Manley Adams. And this book, we think, was probably put together by an organization like a commerce of industry type of group or chamber of commerce type of group. So Liz mentioned in her introduction about the images that we're trying to put online here. So the Elgin History Museum has over 8,000 artifacts in its collection. Only a small fraction of these can be exhibited at one time. Obviously, there's space limits here. But photographs of the artifacts allow more people to learn about the artifact. People doing research can look them up online. To date, we have over 2,000 items that have been photographed and are viewable online. If you go to the Elgin History Museum website, you can scroll down to view these. You'll see a page looking something like this one on the left, or on the right, I should say. And then you can do various searches on there to see the photos. So some of what you might see if you look at these photos, here's a medical device from a long time ago. This is a Salvador Dali designed compact from the Elgin American collection. an old time radio, a toy horse, a watch, and there's more than one watch photo in this collection, as we have quite a bit from the Elgin National Watch Company. Watchmaker tools. Here's a bottle. Again, we have tons of bottles. So because of Elgin's rich history in the dairy industry and a few breweries, a lot of bottles in our collection. A sweater from Elgin High School, a toy soldier. There's military memorabilia, all kinds of other things in there. So I've been doing a lot of these photographs. I'm not the only one who's been doing them, but I've been doing probably the majority in recent months. And as I've been working on these, I started noticing a lot of aesthetic properties to the different items I'm photographing. Some have really unique kind of lines and shape and texture, which is something I'm really big into as a photographer. Other items really show off the design of the time they were made. They may be kind of an Art Deco, or they may be Victorian design built into it. So that gave me the idea to create the exhibit in this room. And the exhibit consists of 17 photographs right over here on my right, your left, or south, whichever that is. And these are museum artifacts created to bring out the aesthetic properties. But the neat thing about it is what Liz and Beth and others who worked on this with me did, is we put the actual artifact right next to the photo. So you can see my kind of artistic interpretation of it, and then you can see the actual item, except for a couple items which are too big to be in this room that are elsewhere in the museum. Some are macro images, some are digitally manipulated, and some just show off the craftsmanship of the artisan who made the item. The object of the exhibit was to provide us a different way to think about artifacts that tell the story of our past, and maybe delve just a little deeper into what those artifacts mean. So the exhibit's going to run through mid to end of this month. And there's an exhibit book. Spoiler alert, this is an advertisement now. There's an exhibit book which you can look at for free online. You can see a pretty good preview of it online at blurb.com. You would just look up art and artifacts or search on Ira Marcus, and you will find this. It's also available for purchase, but you can look at it for free online. The other little piece of my advertisement, like I say, spoiler alert, is my card is over there. All of these images in the exhibit are available for purchase as prints and on objects such as coffee mugs, jigsaw puzzles, etc. End of advertisement. My apologies, Liz and board members, but had to sneak that in. So as we wrap up, you may be thinking, gee, I'd like to preserve some of my own images. It's a great way to remember heirlooms and other objects you no longer wish to keep. I mean, do we all have grandma's tea set that, you know, we don't know what to do with? At least we do. I don't know about the rest of you. Photographing it, you can keep the photograph and then get rid of the set, however you choose. Another good way, good reason for photographing some of your precious objects is it establishes a record for insurance claims in the event of loss for fire, theft, tornado, etc. And you would think, oh, well, that won't happen to me. I've actually known two people who've had house fires and who would have benefited from having photographs for their insurance claims. Also, finally, can be used to advertise items to sell if you're looking at disposing things, wanting to sell them online. So for anyone interested, we're pretty much done at this point. There will be a short tutorial that I'll offer on photographing artifacts with some hands-on practice. We brought some things and have some setups. So anybody who wants to stick around, you know, whether you've never taken a photograph and you use a cell phone, or whether you're an experienced photographer, they're available for you. So with that, I want to thank you all for attending and your patience. We ran a little over. I apologize for that, but you know, I get moving here. And when I'll ask for your questions or comments, but I just want to put up here, anybody can walk up and take a look at this, or if you want more, just a list of some of the sources I used for the information in case you want to delve any deeper into these subjects. So thank you very much. Any questions? Trish?
Stan asked, or she that I have a photo from Pugsley at 52 Grove Avenue. It looks like it only existed in 1894 to 95, which was very helpful to identify kids in the photo. Did you run across any information about that studio in your research?
No, I didn't. I don't know if David might remember ever seeing anything on Pugsley, the studio. If you have the exact year on there, we do have city directories from the time. That may lead to finding that, but I did not see that name at all in there. Other questions?
But I do have a photograph of my great grandmother in her casket,
Mhm.
and also a little baby that she did not die in childbirth, but the baby died at the same time. And it's really a beautiful photograph. All the flowers are hanging around, you know, and it's probably 100, close to 100 years old, but it's still like it's so clear and precise picture.
Mhm.
Just kind of,
Yeah.
after you get over the shock of seeing it the first time, you can then appreciate the beauty
Well,
of the picture itself.
One of the things about some of these older photographs versus a digital photograph today, a digital photograph, if you think of a mosaic made of a lot of little pieces, that's all a digital photograph is. And depending on what generation of camera you have or sensor kind of determines the quality. But the older photographs that were made with chemical and film, they're continuous. And you get some good quality photographs of some of these has so much more, many more degrees of shading in them and detail that some of those old photographs really are superior to what we get today, even with all our technology. I wanted to point out something here. Anybody notice this background I use for the slides?
I have several of those.
This is an old photo album. This was actually my grandfather's photo album. And there's a quill, or not a quill, but a fountain pen pointing to an image there. That's my dad when he was 10 years old. And I just, you know, kind of, it's a fun way of preserving something. I mean, we still have the album that was my grandfather's. It's kind of falling apart. But again, photographing the photographs just keeps it alive. Anything else? Okay, what I'd like to do is take maybe a 2-minute break for people. Anybody who wants to stick around, and even if you don't want to stick around, we've got a handout. I've got for the tutorial, there are actually just 3 slides I'm going to go through. And then for people who want to try some things out, we've got a setup over here. So if you're not going to stick around but would like the handout of the tutorial, come see Jackie. And if you are going to stick around, we'll just wait for things to settle down for about 2 minutes. We won't keep you waiting long because we already went over a bit. So we will start the tutorial in about 2 minutes. And with that, I thank you once again.